Today we're diving into the absolutely wild roller coaster that is Japan's entire history. And trust me, this story has more plot twists than your favorite anime series. From ancient samurai warriors to cutting-edge technology, from devastating earthquakes to economic miracles, Japan's journey through time reads like the most epic adventure novel ever written. We're talking about a civilization that gave us both the art of flower arranging and the atomic bomb, peaceful meditation practices, and brutal military conquests. But here's what's really fascinating. Japan's story isn't just about one country's rise to power. It's actually a masterclass in adaptation, resilience, and the incredible human ability to completely reinvent yourself when the world demands it. By the end of this video, you'll understand how Japan's unique approach to embracing change while preserving tradition created one of the most fascinating cultures on Earth. So buckle up, because we're about to take a journey through thousands of years of Japanese history, and I promise you'll never look at Japan the same way again. Let's start at the very beginning, because Japan's origin story is unlike any other nation's. Picture this. Around 30,000 years ago, during the last ice age, Japan wasn't even a collection of islands. It was connected to mainland Asia by land bridges, and the first humans walked across these frozen pathways into what would eventually become the Japanese archipelago. These early inhabitants were hunter-gatherers who developed one of the world's earliest pottery traditions. We're talking about ceramic work that dates back over 14,000 years. That's older than agriculture itself in most parts of the world. They called this period the Jomon era, named after the distinctive rope pattern decorations on their pottery. But here's where things get interesting. While the rest of the world was figuring out farming, these Jomon people were perfectly content, living off the abundant natural resources of their island home. They had no need to develop agriculture because the forests, rivers, and seas provided everything they needed. It was like living in a natural paradise where survival didn't require the back-breaking labor that defined early civilization elsewhere. This period of blissful isolation lasted for thousands of years, but around 300 BCE, everything changed. New people arrived from the Korean peninsula, bringing with them revolutionary technologies, rice farming, bronze tools, and iron weapons. These newcomers mixed with the existing Jomon population, creating what we now call the Yayoi culture. The introduction of rice farming was absolutely transformative. Suddenly, Japan could support much larger populations, and with surplus food came the luxury of specialization. People could become craftsmen, warriors, or leaders instead of spending all their time hunting and gathering. This was Japan's agricultural revolution, and it set the stage for everything that followed. As rice farming spread across the islands, something fascinating happened. Different regions began developing their own distinct cultures and power structures. By the 3rd century CE, Japan had become a patchwork of competing kingdoms, each vying for control over the best rice-growing lands. This competition would define Japanese politics for the next several centuries. The most powerful of these early kingdoms was Yamato, located in what is now the Nara region. The Yamato rulers were incredibly clever. Instead of simply conquering their rivals, they created an elaborate mythology that positioned them as descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. This wasn't just political propaganda, it was the birth of what would become the imperial system that still exists in Japan today. But the Yamato leaders knew that military might and divine mythology alone weren't enough to create a stable civilization. They looked across the sea to China, which had already developed sophisticated systems of government, philosophy, and culture. What happened next was one of history's most successful cultural adoptions. Starting in the 6th century, Japan began importing Chinese ideas on an unprecedented scale. Buddhism arrived and quickly spread throughout the islands, bringing with it not just religious practices but entire systems of art, architecture, and scholarship. The Japanese adopted Chinese writing systems, governmental structures, and even city planning concepts. Yet, here's what makes Japan unique among nations that borrowed from China. They never simply copied everything wholesale. Instead, they had this remarkable ability to take foreign ideas and adapt them to fit Japanese sensibilities and needs. Buddhism, for example, didn't replace the indigenous Shinto beliefs, but rather merged with them, creating a distinctly Japanese form of spirituality. This pattern of selective adaptation would become Japan's greatest strength throughout history. They were never too proud to learn from others, but they were also never willing to lose their own identity in the process. The 8th and 9th centuries marked what many consider Japan's first golden age. The capital was established at Nara, then later moved to Kyoto, which would remain the imperial capital for over 1,000 years. This period saw an explosion of Japanese literature, art, and culture that rivaled anything being produced anywhere else in the world. This was when Japanese women produced some of the world's greatest literary works. The Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu around the year 1000, is often considered the world's first novel. Think about that. While Europe was still struggling through the Dark Ages, Japanese court ladies were creating sophisticated psychological literature that explores themes of love, loss, and the fleeting nature of beauty. But even as Japanese culture was flourishing, the political system was becoming increasingly complex and unstable. The imperial court in Kyoto had become more focused on poetry and ceremony than actual governance. Real power was shifting to provincial families who controlled land and armies. This shift culminated in the rise of the warrior class, the samurai. These weren't just soldiers. They were an entirely new social order based on military service, personal loyalty, and a strict code of honor. The samurai represented something uniquely Japanese, the fusion of battlefield pragmatism with sophisticated cultural refinement. In 1185, a warrior named Minamoto Yoritomo established the first military government, or shogunate, in Kamakura. This was revolutionary. For the first time in Japanese history, political power was officially separated from the imperial court. The emperor remained as a ceremonial figurehead, while real authority rested with the military leader, the shogun. This system would define Japanese politics for the next 700 years, but it certainly wasn't always stable. The medieval period was marked by almost constant warfare, as different samurai clans fought for control. Yet, even during these violent centuries, Japanese culture continued to develop in remarkable ways. Zen Buddhism arrived from China and found fertile ground among the warrior class. The idea that enlightenment could be achieved through disciplined practice and direct experience appealed to samurai sensibilities. This led to the development of distinctly Japanese arts like the tea ceremony, flower arranging, and martial arts that emphasized both physical skill and spiritual development. The medieval period also saw Japan face its greatest external threat. In 1274 and again in 1281, the Mongol Empire, which had conquered China and much of Asia, launched massive invasion fleets against Japan. These weren't small raids. We're talking about hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of warriors attempting to subjugate the Japanese islands. But Japan got incredibly lucky. Both invasion attempts were destroyed by massive storms that the Japanese called kamikaze, or divine wind. They interpreted these storms as proof that their islands were protected by the gods, and this belief in divine protection would have profound implications for Japanese psychology for centuries to come. The failure of the Mongol invasions also reinforced Japan's sense of being special and apart from the rest of the world. This island nation had successfully resisted the most powerful empire on Earth, not through superior military might, but through what they saw as divine intervention. However, the medieval period wasn't all warfare and warrior culture. This era also saw the development of a merchant class and the growth of cities. Japanese craftsmen became renowned for their skill in metalworking, producing swords that were not just weapons, but works of art. Japanese steel became legendary across Asia for its quality and beauty. By the 15th century, Japan was fragmenting into numerous independent domains ruled by local warlords called daimyo. This period, known as the Sengoku, or Warring States era, was characterized by almost constant military campaigns as different lords fought to expand their territories. It was during this chaotic time that Europeans first arrived in Japan. In 1543, Portuguese traders landed on a small island and introduced firearms to Japan. This wasn't just a technological exchange, it was Japan's first significant contact with the outside world in centuries. The arrival of European weapons technology had immediate and dramatic effects. Japanese smiths quickly mastered the production of firearms and began manufacturing them on a large scale. Within a few decades, Japan probably had more guns than any other country in the world. But along with traders came missionaries. Christianity, brought by Portuguese and Spanish Jesuit priests, began attracting converts among both common people and some daimyo. For a brief period, it looked like Japan might become a Christian nation. This is where one of Japan's most remarkable leaders enters our story, Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was a daimyo who had a vision of unifying all of Japan under his rule, and he was willing to use any means necessary to achieve this goal. He was one of the first Japanese leaders to fully embrace European military technology, equipping his armies with large numbers of firearms. Nobunaga was also remarkably tolerant of Christianity, not because he was particularly religious, but because he saw the Christian missionaries as useful allies against the powerful Buddhist monasteries that opposed his rule. He even allowed Christians to build churches in his territories and protected them from persecution. But Nobunaga's career was cut short when he was betrayed and killed by one of his own retainers in 1582. However, his vision of a unified Japan was continued by his successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who completed the conquest of Japan by 1590. Hideyoshi was a fascinating character. He rose from humble origins to become the most powerful man in Japan through sheer ability and determination. Under his rule, Japan experienced its first period of complete internal peace in over a century. He also launched ambitious invasions of Korea in the 1590s, though these ultimately failed. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, power passed to Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would establish the most successful and long-lasting government in Japanese history. After winning the crucial Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, Tokugawa established his capital at Edo, which would later become Tokyo. The Tokugawa shogunate created a system of government so stable and effective that it lasted for over 250 years without any major internal wars. They achieved this through a combination of strict social control, economic regulation, and perhaps most significantly, almost complete isolation from the outside world. This isolation policy, known as sakoku, was implemented gradually during the early 17th century. The Tokugawa rulers had become increasingly suspicious of foreign influence, particularly Christianity, which they saw as a threat to social stability and their own authority. By the 1630s, Japan had expelled almost all foreigners, banned Christianity, and strictly limited trade with the outside world. Only a small number of Chinese and Dutch traders were allowed to conduct business, and they were confined to the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor. For over 2 centuries, Japan turned inward, developing its culture and economy in isolation from the rest of the world. This period, known as the Edo era, saw remarkable achievements in art, literature, and technology. The population grew steadily, cities flourished, and a vibrant urban culture emerged. The isolation also allowed Japan to develop a highly sophisticated domestic economy. Without foreign competition, Japanese craftsmen and farmers developed techniques that were perfectly adapted to local conditions. They created sustainable agricultural practices that supported a population of over 30 million people on a relatively small amount of arable land. Japanese popular culture flourished during this period. The pleasure quarters of major cities became centers of artistic innovation, producing new forms of theater, literature, and visual art. Woodblock printing made books and artwork affordable for ordinary people, creating Japan's first mass culture. But isolation came at a cost. While Japan was turning inward, the rest of the world was experiencing the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the early stages of industrialization. By the 19th century, the technological gap between Japan and the Western powers had become enormous. This gap became impossible to ignore when, in 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Tokyo Bay with a fleet of steam-powered warships. Perry's black ships represented technology so advanced that they seemed almost magical to the Japanese. The Americans demanded that Japan open its ports to foreign trade, and they had the military power to enforce this demand. The arrival of Perry's fleet created a crisis that shook Japanese society to its core. For over 2 centuries, they had believed that isolation made them strong and pure. Now they were confronted with the reality that isolation had actually made them weak and vulnerable. The Tokugawa government, faced with the choice between war with technologically superior foreigners or abandoning the isolation policy, chose to compromise. They signed treaties opening Japanese ports to American and European trade, but these agreements were so one-sided that they essentially turned Japan into a semi-colonial state. This humiliation triggered a political revolution that would transform Japan more completely than any event in its previous history. Young samurai from domains that had always resented Tokugawa rule rallied around the emperor, calling for the restoration of imperial authority and the expulsion of foreigners. In 1868, this movement succeeded in overthrowing the Tokugawa shogunate in what became known as the Meiji Restoration. But here's where Japan surprised the world once again. Instead of trying to expel the foreigners through military force, the new Meiji government decided to beat the West at its own game. The young leaders who came to power in 1868 made a remarkable decision. They would modernize Japan by adopting the best ideas and technologies from around the world. Their slogan was Fukoku Kyohei, rich country, strong military, and they pursued this goal with single-minded determination. What followed was perhaps the most rapid and successful modernization in world history. Within a single generation, Japan transformed itself from an isolated feudal society into a modern industrial nation. They built railroads, telegraph lines, and modern factories. They created a modern educational system, a new legal code, and a powerful military organized along European lines. The Tokugawa government, faced with the choice between war with technologically superior foreigners or abandoning the isolation policy, chose to compromise. They signed treaties opening Japanese ports to American and European trade, but these agreements were so one-sided that they essentially turned Japan into a semi-colonial state. But once again, Japan demonstrated its remarkable ability to adopt foreign ideas while maintaining its own identity. The new government carefully studied different Western institutions and selected what worked best for Japanese conditions. They adopted the German model for their military, the British model for their navy, and the American model for primary education. The speed of Japan's transformation astonished the world. In 1894 to 95, less than 30 years after the Meiji Restoration, Japan fought and won a war against China, demonstrating that it had become a major regional power. Even more shocking, in 1904 to 05, Japan defeated Russia, a European great power, in a war over influence in Korea and Manchuria. These military victories were not just about showing off Japan's new strength. They were part of a deliberate strategy to gain respect and equal treatment from the Western powers. Japan wanted to be accepted as a member of the Great Power Club, and military success was seen as the key to achieving this goal. By the early 20th century, Japan had indeed achieved its goal of becoming a modern, powerful nation. It had a thriving industrial economy, a modern educational system, and a military that could compete with any in the world. Japan had also begun building its own empire, annexing Korea in 1910 and establishing a sphere of influence in China. But Japan's rapid rise also created new tensions and contradictions within Japanese society. The Meiji government had successfully modernized the country's institutions, but many Japanese felt that they had lost something essential in the process. There was a growing tension between those who wanted to embrace Western values completely and those who wanted to preserve traditional Japanese culture. This tension came to a head during the 1930s, when a group of military officers and ultranationalist politicians gained increasing influence over Japanese policy. They argued that Japan's mission was not to become like the Western powers, but to create a new kind of empire based on Asian values and Japanese leadership. This ideology led Japan into an increasingly aggressive foreign policy that culminated in the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Japan's leaders believed they could create a vast Asian empire by driving the Western powers out of the region through a series of rapid military victories. For a brief period, this strategy seemed to work. Japanese forces conquered huge areas of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, creating an empire that stretched from the Aleutian Islands to the borders of Australia. But Japan had fatally underestimated both the industrial capacity of the United States and the determination of the American people. The Pacific War that followed was devastating for Japan. American bombers systematically destroyed Japanese cities, and by 1945, Japan's economy and infrastructure were in ruins. The war ended with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. The defeat was total and traumatic. For the first time in its history, Japan was occupied by foreign troops. General Douglas MacArthur and his staff essentially governed Japan for the next 7 years, implementing a series of reforms designed to democratize Japanese society and prevent future militarism. Once again, Japan demonstrated its remarkable adaptability. Instead of resisting the occupation, most Japanese embraced the new democratic institutions and focused their energies on rebuilding their shattered country. The new constitution, which went into effect in 1947, renounced war as a means of settling disputes and established Japan as a pacifist nation. What happened next was another miracle of transformation, the Japanese economic miracle. Starting in the 1950s, Japan experienced 3 decades of rapid economic growth that transformed it from a war-torn nation into the world's second-largest economy. This growth was built on Japan's traditional strengths: a highly educated workforce, strong work ethic, and ability to adapt foreign technologies to Japanese conditions. Japanese companies like Sony, Toyota, and Honda became global brands synonymous with quality and innovation. By the 1980s, Japan had become so economically successful that many Americans feared it would overtake the United States as the world's dominant economic power. Japanese companies were buying iconic American properties like Rockefeller Center, and Japanese manufacturing techniques were being copied around the world. But this period of rapid growth came to an abrupt end in the early 1990s when Japan's asset price bubble collapsed. The following decade, known in Japan as the Lost Decade, was characterized by economic stagnation, deflation, and social uncertainty. Today, Japan faces new challenges as it adapts to an aging population, increasing international competition, and changing global conditions. But if history has taught us anything, it's that Japan has an extraordinary ability to reinvent itself when circumstances demand it. Throughout its long history, Japan has repeatedly demonstrated the ability to maintain its cultural identity while adapting to changing circumstances, from the adoption of Chinese civilization in the ancient period, to the selective modernization of the Meiji era, to the democratic transformation after World War II. Japan has shown that it's possible to change without losing your essential character. This story of adaptation and resilience offers valuable lessons for our modern world. In an era of rapid technological change and global uncertainty, Japan's approach of embracing useful innovations while preserving core values provides a model for how societies can successfully navigate transformation. Japan's history shows us that isolation and rigid adherence to tradition can lead to stagnation and weakness, but that wholesale adoption of foreign ideas can also result in the loss of cultural identity. The key is finding the right balance, being open to change while maintaining what makes you unique. As we look to the future, Japan continues to face significant challenges, from demographic decline to economic competition from other Asian nations. But given its remarkable track record of successful adaptation over more than 1,000 years, there's every reason to believe that Japan will find creative solutions to these challenges as well. The story of Japan is ultimately a story about the incredible human capacity for change and renewal. It's a reminder that no matter how difficult the circumstances, it's possible to transform yourself while still remaining true to who you are. And that's a lesson that applies not just to nations, but to each of us as individuals navigating our own challenges and transformations.